Amit Chaudhuri is a professor of creative writing at Ashoka University, where he is also director of the Center for the Creative and the Critical. He is the author of 7 novels, the latest of which is Friend of My Youth. He's also a poet, essayist, short story writer, and musician. His work of nonfiction includes Finding the Raga. His 3rd book of poems, Ramunajan, came out in 2021 in the UK. Among his awards are the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, the Government of India's Sahitya Akademi Award, and the inaugural Infosys Prize in the Humanities. Srikanth Reddy is a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Chicago, where he edits the Phoenix Poets book series at the University of Chicago Press. His latest book, A Poetry Underworld Lit, was a finalist for the Griffin International Poetry Prize, the T.S. Eliot 4 Quartets Prize, and a Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year for 2020. His work has appeared in Harper's, The Guardian, The New York Times, and Poetry, among other venues. The recipient of fellowships from the Creative Capital Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. This is their panel. Thank you so much for joining us.
An honor to be in conversation with Amit Chaudhuri, who was first known to me as a novelist, as in some ways the novelist of kind of post-war modern Indian and diasporic Indian experience. And only later did I learn of Amit's deep engagement with poetry. And so today's kind of a really special opportunity to talk with you about poetry, your own poetry, to hear some of your poetry, and also to think a little bit about how poetry animates and informs your work in many other genres and modalities. So we'll begin with some poetry. I'm thinking of it as in celebration of the forthcoming publication of Amit's new and selected poems with the legendary New York Review of Books book series, coming soon to a bookstore near you. And this volume will actually collect work from Amit's 3 previous collections of poetry and new work as well. So it's going to be an exciting event for readers of Amit's writing and of Indian literature, Anglophone Indian literature, more broadly speaking. So would you care to share some poems from the collections?
I really liked what Lina said about poetry being an act of giving, which is rather than taking, something that literature is about, and it's worth reminding us about that. And this seems as good an occasion as any for that thought to come back to us. How should I do this, Chico? I mean, I'm going to start by reading a very early poem.
Please do.
And should I give some background? Or?
I'd love to. It's great to see this edition of the book, actually, and if you could talk a little bit about when the book came out,
sure.
And I'd love to just hear about your life in poetry as you read it, if that's not.
So maybe before I start reading the first poem that I'm going to read, just give you a little bit of background about my relationship with poetry and something which you didn't know about until later, you said, right?
I mean, of course, you write about being a student of poetry and about poets in your novels, so I knew that was animating your work in life, but still.
Yes, yes. Odysseus Abroad contains quite a bit of kind of description about my life as an apprentice poet.
Early novels as well.
Yeah, right. I was kind of deeply drawn to the poetic form, I think, very early on. Kind of broken up lines, rather than prose, which I must have, and still do connect with hard work. And I'm trying to think. I mean, I picked up English after I was admitted. So when I was like about 5 years old, when I was admitted to Cathedral and John Connon School. Without knowing any English. Because I was growing up in Bombay, and my parents, being the kind of modern Bengalis they were, thought that we can't speak to our child in the English language. And they had great pride in the Bengali language, which is something I learned about later and which affected me a lot. When I say pride in the Bengali language, I mean a whole ethos, a culture, and a particular sense of modernity, and which includes a very modern literary tradition in Bengal. Anyway, so that must have played a part unconsciously in their speaking to me in Bangla as I was growing up in Bombay, and this is something that I and my wife repeated with our daughter, actually, who was growing up here in Calcutta. She was born in '98. We found ourselves unable to speak to her in English. There seemed something wrong about it. I'm not saying that this position is justified. I'm just saying that there was something irrational, maybe, but deeply felt.
Is it maybe a little bit to do with your language of parental affection?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. And so she picked it up from other children in the building. Picked up English from other children in the building. So I would speak with my parents in Bangla and so in Bombay, and people who worked in the house in Hindi. And when I was finally admitted into school, which was a very unhappy experience for me, getting into school, but the headmistress, who was half Bengali, half English, her name was Mrs. Banerjee, said to my mother, give him Ladybird books to read and comic books to read, and he will pick up English in a couple of weeks, which is what I did. I picked up English in a couple of weeks, as children do, and they pick up things fast. And immediately, on picking up English, I began to write in English. And I wrote a story about either being a dog or acquiring a dog as a pet. Something which was always an ambition of mine, both being a dog and anyway. But then, so that was an aberration in that it was a story. I later on in my life would become less and less interested in stories, but then very soon began to write poems. My first kind of inspiration was Dr. Seuss, I think, and then following that, I just went through years and years of apprentice excitement, of writing poetry, imitating poets. And of course, the wonderful thing about that kind of time of excitement is that you think you are doing just as well as the poets you're imitating. Otherwise you wouldn't be doing, you wouldn't be undertaking that kind of activity. I mean, there's no pedagogy involved to tell you that this isn't right, or you should improve this or that. It's a fantasy world, the world of apprenticeship. I wonder if it exists anymore. I'm sure it does. But people are kind of deflated early on as they get into creative writing workshops, maybe. But there was none of that for me. So I had an ambition to become a poet quite early on, and it was an ambition.
Your first literary ambition.
It was my first literary, and only for a long time, literary ambition. I had other ambitions, of course. I mean, I wanted to be in the army. I wanted to be in the police. I mean, there were those things as well when I was a child. But those things, in the end, I wanted to be the chauffeur of a car. I mean, that was my first ambition. None of those survived, but the one to do with writing poetry did survive. So when I made my way to England, I realized now I'm writing poetry in English, and I'm writing marvelous poetry in English, I thought. And I now need to go to England and get my due, basically. So so the whole business of academic study, which was the first port of call, was University College London in the early 80s. So I took a while getting there. I could have gone there a couple of years earlier, but I'd also begun to kind of study Indian classical music. So I was dawdling my way through all these things. And I arrived there with the ambition of becoming a famous poet. And, it's such a different time. The romance of the poet, the romance of poetry. The whole thing to do with the novel hadn't even entered my head.
In a kind of a post-colonial moment, right? I mean, I think of Odysseus,
Yeah.
in some ways.
Right, yes. So yeah, I was there in England or in London where, there was already, sort of changed by the immigration, the mass immigration that had taken place in the 70s from Africa as well, from Indians from Africa besides, Africans and the West Indians. I was there in the aftermath of, the battles to do with race had been fought, and just in the preamble to the new Britain of Thatcher that was coming into being then, and but there I was at University College London, and I never went to a single class. I stayed at home. I watched children's TV, and I watched Mr. Ben, and I liked watching that because it was very artistic. The children's TV, and full of meta. The budgets were minuscule, so they had to depend on metaphor, synecdoche, suggestion, in order to, have their effect. In contrast to the changes that were coming to evening, daytime, adult TV, primetime TV, which was already changing. And there I was writing poetry, and I'd begun to send off poems to what was then called, I don't know if it still exists, the National Poetry Competition. They used to have this every year. And of course you had to pay some money to get the poems, to submit the poems. And then, I would spend time waiting to hear from them. Basically that, you've got first prize or whatever. But that wouldn't happen. And so then I knew that the announcement was going to be made on radio, where they would also be interviewing the winners. And I would tune in case I hadn't got the letter by mistake. Yeah. So I tuned in, and of course, I wasn't being mentioned in that kind of list of winners and runners-up, and the very boring poems had won the prize. So the whole thing was completely, flummoxing to me. I spent the first couple of years in that way. In my third year, I had a wonderful tutor, the South African novelist Dan Jacobson. He read my poems. He was extremely enthusiastic about my essays. The first time I met somebody who made me feel I can write prose that makes sense, And about my poems, he said, "You have a sense of rhythm." And then he would make gentle kind of sort of jibes and about what I'd said in the poems or whatever. So and I would ignore that. I would think that he's not a man who really loves poetry. He's not a man for poetry. He's because he was a novelist. He's a prose writer. So.
And who are the poets you were idolizing at that time and emulating? Where had you discovered Geoffrey Hill at that
Their
point?
laughter is contagious. Yeah. The poets I was idealizing. I liked Larkin. You see, I was miserable in London, and so and I was generally miserable. So Larkin really chimed in, and. I admired the modernists. I misread the modernists. I misread Larkin, although I sensed something interesting was going on. I mean, those sensations were subconscious in terms of what I was really responding to, which might have something to do with light, for instance. But I would focus on the misery, and with modernism, say with T.S. Eliot, who was still being discussed in those days. So with T.S. Eliot, I mean, we had misreadings to fall back on, because he would be talked about as a poet who was talking about, who was writing about the trauma of the fragmentation of Western civilization. And that's the way he was being read, and that reading was being sold to us as students. And we were, anyway, as students, some of us, like me, we were preoccupied with traumas to civilization. You know, so that reading worked, you know, because we felt traumatized for some reason, because of our age. So you know, in the meantime, my father had retired, and they had moved from the high building they had occupied, the flat on the 25th floor. So I'd grown up mainly on the kind of upper reaches in Bombay of buildings, 12th story, 25th story. They had moved to the 3rd story of a building, after my father retired, that is, of a building in St. Cyril Road in Bandra. So St. Cyril Road then was still an extraordinary lane. The Bandra was still dominated by not just Christians, but by the markers of Christianity, not just churches, but also clubs, you know, congregations, secular congregations of Christian activity, festive activity, all of that. I remember around the time of Christmas, I mean, kind of things going on in the lane, young men playing guitars, walking through the street, singing carols and songs. So I would come back from England, and I would come back to this 3rd story flat, and I was very happy to be in a lane, looking out on the street and looking out onto another flat, rather than, as I had when I was growing up, looking out onto the Marine Drive or the sea, the panoramic vision. And this reminded me why I had loved my uncle's house in Calcutta so much, why it had meant so much to me when I was growing up. Because, it was a 3-story house in South Calcutta, which looked out on other houses, and beyond which there was a railway track, and you could hear, if not really see, the trains. And that kind of economy of being, that ecology, that urban ecology of modernity, is something I had, without realizing it, responded so deeply to in Calcutta when growing up, and which taught me later on to read, say, Mansfield, Catherine Mansfield, or James Joyce, or to watch a certain kind of film, you know, by Marcel Carnet, or, you know, French cinema of a certain kind, where there's a shot from the kitchen into another kitchen, you know. This is what my encounter with Calcutta is what had taught me to view those films and read those books, I think. When I went to St. Cyril Road, I rediscovered what it meant to be in that sort of particular occupied advantage position, where one was participating in the urban without participating in it. So I went back to England and I wrote a poem called St. Cyril Road. I was 23 years old then. So this is the poem I'm going to read out and then tell you a little bit more about it. So I wrote a series of poems about the place. This one is kind of, it's I think it's got 7 stresses. I don't know how I came on this form, and it rhymes, it's rhyming couplets, although you may not be able to hear it. St. Cyril Road, Bombay. So I'll read a couple of poems about that area. Every city has its minority with its ironical tiny village fortressed against the barbarians, the giant ransacks, and the pillage of the larger faith. In England, for instance, the Asians cling to their ways as they never do in their own land. On the other hand, the Englishman strays from his time-worn English beliefs. Go to an Asian street in London and you will find a ritual of life that refuses to compete with the unschooled world outside. In Bombay, it's the Christian minority that clings like ivy to its own branches of faith. The Christian boy with the guitar sings more sincerely than the Hindu boy. And in St. Cyril Road, you're familiar with cottages hung with flora and fainting, drooping bougainvillea, where the noon is a charged battery and evenings a visionary gloom in which insects make secret noises and men inside their single rooms sing quaint Portuguese love songs. Here you forget, at last, to remember that the rest of Bombay has drifted away, truant and dismembered from the old Bombay. There, rootless, garish, and widely cosmopolitan, where every executive is an executive and every other man a Caliban in two-toned shoes, and each building is a brooding tyrant that towers over streets ogling with fat lights. Give me the bougainvillea flowers and a room where I can hear birds arguing. I won't live in a pillar of stone as ants and spiders live in the cracks of walls, searching for food alone in the sun-forgotten darkness. That's why I've come to St. Cyril Road to lose myself among the Christians and feel Bombay like a huge load off my long-suffering chest, woken up at 6 o'clock in the morning by half-wit birds who are excited in the knowledge that day is dawning on the sleeping lane. That's what I want. The new day enters my head like a new fragrance. I rise dignified like Lazarus from the dead. So this was written when I was 23. I mean, you have to sort of, pardon its kind of excesses and immaturities, but it was a discovery for me. It comprises a discovery, and Carl Miller, who was, the founding editor of LRB, and he was also at UCL. So, at UCL, as I said, I spent 3 years without interacting with anybody, but watching a lot of children's TV, besides doing other things. After I'd taken my exams, I got called by Carl Miller, who was the head of the department, Lord Northcliffe professor, etc. So I thought, I must have failed. Anyway, he called me and he said I was responsible on the basis of on the piece of writing that you had submitted in getting you admitted here. I'm glad you're here, etc., etc. And then I said, can I give you my poems? I used to say that to almost everybody in those days, anyone I came into contact with. So I gave him my poems, and he spotted this one. He liked all of them, but he said, I think they're apprentice work, they're interesting. This one. And he published it in the LRB. That was 86.
So this was before you'd published fiction?
Before I'd published fiction. So this came out in the LRB, and it makes references to things that happened. I mean, like the boy with the guitar, and the waking up in the morning. So the first time I arrived in St. Cyril Road to be with my parents from London during the holidays, I was woken up by this terrifying sound at about 6 o'clock. Then I realized it was birds. And I hadn't heard them when I was on the 25th or 12th story. So that's there in the poem. And it was the first time I wrote about a place called St. Cyril Road. And St. Cyril Road, I mean, 2 years before I'd written this poem, or maybe even 2 months before I'd written it, I wouldn't have thought that I could have written a poem about a place called St. Cyril Road. Because I wanted to do something equal to Eliot, talk about the disintegration of some sort of civilization, but St. Cyril Road would have been beneath me. But so you know.
So it really is like a movement from the high tower of, Romanticism and the modernist tradition to a kind of urban geography of observation.
Yeah.
And
my misreading, my adolescent misreading of Romanticism and of modernism and all the tools for that misreading were there for us. I mean, the words like existentialism, absurd, all of that. We could fall back on them. But then to move suddenly to life and to St. Cyril Road. And I think Lawrence was a part of that move, reading Sons and Lovers. He suddenly made me see that something else was possible in terms of embracing life. I'm sort of quoting Nietzsche here, of course. Embrace your fate. Say yes to life. Anyway, I'll just read one more poem from this particular period. The Bandra Medical Store. Again, this is something that happened. My mother was not well. She asked me to go and get some medicine, and I got lost. So, the Bandra Medical Store. Again, it still exists, by the way. So this is in the area. When I first moved here, I had no idea whatsoever where the Bandra Medical Store really was. But someone in the house was ill, so I ventured out, let my legs meander to a chosen path, articulate their own distances. I guess my going out for medicine, even the illness, were just excuses for me to make that uninsisting journey to a place I hadn't seen. Two roads followed each other like long absences. The air smelled of something not there. Branches, pearled and knitted shadows. There was a field with a little landslide of rubble and a little craggy outline of stone. I drifted past heliotropic rubbish heaps, elderly white houses. An aircraft hummed overhead. And did the houses look like rows of slender barley from the pilot's window, row pursuing row, held in a milieu of whiteness, unswayed by a clean flowing wind. Then the plane donned a thick cloud. All it left was a cargo of loaded silence. I supposed that I must be lost. It grew evening. Trees fluttered in the dusk sough like winged Paleolithic moths, eddying towards the closing eyes of the sun. I asked someone, do you know where the Bandra Medical Store is? The directions he gave me were motionless, gestures scrawled on a darkening fresco. I stepped forward, intentionally trampled a crisp leaf, which then made the only intelligible comment of the evening. But I took care not to squash a warrior ant that scuttled before me. He was so dignified, so black. Had I been smaller, I'd have ridden him back home or off into the sunset. So this is again from that period. It came out in the London magazine. So all of this is written around the age of 23, 24. It's my move towards place and life, away from the more kind of epic or grand preoccupations I'd had earlier.
And in some ways, I can't help but imagine that it was also, in retrospect, look like the beginnings of your birth as a writer of fiction, right? The move from the, you described the move from the high-rise apartment to the, street level or third floor urban ecology as a change in of environment, but it's also a change in the optics of your literary imagination.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And being inside a kitchen, looking into another kitchen, right? That kind of immersive experience that gripped your literary imagination, and you wrote about at the time within lyric poetry. Also, seems like the first chapter of birth of a novelist.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is then what I began to explore as at the same time as I was writing these poems, which was in my gap year between UCL and Oxford. So 1986 was that gap year, and that's when I also began to think of writing the novel. Which is Strange and Sublime Address. Right. Yeah.
And for those in the audience who don't know, the dissertation that you wrote in at Oxford is a dissertation on a study of D.H. Lawrence's
That's
poetry.
right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. So yes, I was kind of, I was thinking of writing a novel about a boy taking a holiday in Calcutta and going and spending time in his uncle's house. I don't know. It was something to do with the urban, but also the sense of liberation from routine, which a holiday comprises, a sense of emptiness, a sense of vacancy, which is how I thought of the holiday, which would then be a kind of, so instead of plot, one would have that sense of interruption. The sense of an interruption within a narrative is what would, if narrative is one's life, is what would then comprise for me the novel, the novelistic space. So that's what it became, and
which I might just observe is many people's definition of what a lyric poem is, the
Right.
interruption of narrative and
Right.
the opening up of observation.
Right. And this is what the novel was going to be for me. And this is what I see a whole lineage of in writing, going back to the Gita, which I also see as an interruption in narrative. I mean, really, the Gita is the first text that I'm aware of as really addressing this sense of how an interruption might be a space of altered meanings, not meanings in the sense that narrative possesses meanings or meaning. So anyway, the novel, this is what it would become, or what I would want it to be. But I was just thinking it through, and of course, the idea of having a vacation in Calcutta, of all places, rather than some sort of more vacation-worthy destination or place. Yeah. Rather than that, is of course. It means that the energy there comes from re-encountering the ordinary. Everything that you see at home, you see again in a different place, but this time you actually look at it as you don't when you're at home. So at this time, the ordinary comprises a field which is energized during that period of the interruption. So all of this was already there in some of the poems that I was writing. And of course, St. Cyril Road for me was also an interruption. You know, I would come back from England, I would suddenly discover what it meant to be in this neighborhood, or in a neighborhood. And then, just as I had made kind of some mental distinctions between what it meant to look out on something from the 12th story in comparison to the 3rd story, I was also making distinctions between what it meant to live in England, in London, and you know, in St. Cyril Road. And one of the differences was sound. Windows were open, and I became aware of this fact that we are never completely centered in India. So you can hear the sound over there. You know, it's impossible to be. So I'd noticed that in Britain that there was this matter of focus, of interiority, you know, and so when I was on the tube, for instance, I was very aware of people being super aware, although silent, and that they were aware not only of themselves but of each other, but they would never look at each other. And that kind of interiority that one experienced in England, which also made one space so fragile, so he became very aware of incursions on it, you know, as comprising disturbance. I felt in India, in St. Cyril Road, it was very different. You were always decentered. Part of you was always listening, and this interest in listening as something that takes you out of yourself and connects you to somewhere else which is not visible, because you're not listening to things you can see. Just as we don't know what's going on over there. Some sort of hammering seems to be.
Yeah, I have some ideas about what's happening.
Yeah. So, but as of right now, I'm not even imagining what's going on. I'm listening to it, and I'm partly irritated by it. But part of me is taken out of myself, and this is always the case in India. So this stepping out of oneself, also is a form of desire. you want to move towards something else, which you cannot see. You're joined to that by desire. And this was kind of, this was what the novels became about. And which is why I think I stopped writing poetry, because I began to do in the space of the novel, began to explore in the space of the novel what I might have otherwise as a poet. And which is why St. Cyril Road came out, this collection came out only in the early 2000s, because by the time I started writing novels, I had my output of poems had become like one poem a year or two poems a year, and very different from the kind of novels I was writing or the kind of poems that I've just read out. Yeah.
So then, I'm kind of feeling like a lot of what you're talking about. In particular, I'm interested in this idea of literary experience occurring within an interruption of another narrative, right? And it makes me think about the lyric as a kind of moment of, pause or caesura within a narrative. But also,
when does the lyric become that, do you think?
When does it become a kind of a moment that's non-narrative, or that is against narrative or against story, you could say? I would think it may be that it's always already been, right? That it's actually not a historic kind of development, but it's actually a feature of our kind of, imaginative consciousness, right? But I also I'm beginning to see that another way of thinking about lyric poetry, which is that it's involved with a kind of defamiliarization of the ordinary, right? That it makes the stone feel stony, right? Is something that also is a feature of your migratory and diasporic experience of moving from between London, where things feel utterly unfamiliar and defamiliarized, coming back to a home that feels utterly unfamiliar, right? And viewed from that poetic perspective. Right? And so I'm curious how, after long immersion in narrative, with the novels that came out of your Oxford years and onward, how do you return to poetry with Sweet Shop?
Right. So as I said, the novels themselves were anti-narrative. So it wasn't a long immersion in narrative, but a long immersion in this peculiar undertaking of, pretending to write narrative while hating narrative, So long years of that. Long years of exploring decentering. The hostility I'd felt, it was a kind of shared hostility of consciousness to myself and myself to consciousness. We didn't like each other. So that hostility that had kind of come into being in London, interiority, consciousness, and the decentering which I liked, listening, desire, taking you towards something you cannot see, one kitchen window into the other, the ramification, decentering, not just, it's easier to conceive of characters if you place them in a room and constrict yourself to that room, to begin with at least. The moment you kind of open a gap, a window, there is a decentering. You're no longer completely in that character's world. Other worlds are impinging on it. So I'd always been interested in that. Now, why did I move to poetry as a form again? So, Sweet Shop, which was published when? 2018? So another long gap. I wrote these poems in a few months. 2019. Yeah. So I wrote the poems in a few months. I've never done that before. 20 years. Yeah. Right, almost 20 years after St. Cyril Road. And I had become interested in doing an art project. Yeah. So I've kind of have had ideas. That's not the crazy part. The crazy part is that I follow up on them. So then, I decided for 7 years, I thought, I have some ideas for an art project. I had 3 ideas. One was to address this sense of secular wonder that I felt when I saw the portraits of sweet shop owners. When I went to sweet shops in Calcutta, I would see their portraits and I think I cannot distinguish them from the frontispiece pictures or the portraits I've seen of the great poets, scientists, and thinkers of the Bengal Renaissance. They too have, these sweet shop founders, have the same sense of gravitas and mystery. Why is that? So I decided that I would take pictures of these portraits and display them. Especially in Bhimnag, there is a sweet shop in North Kolkata, very legendary sweet shop in Bhimnag, where they have 3 or 4 founders looking very, very serious, very personable, very grand. Alongside them is the picture of another person who also looks serious and grand, who could also be a sweet shop owner, but is actually, I think, Ashutosh Mukherjee. Ashutosh Mukherjee is a great kind of controversial historian, nationalist. He loved Shandesh. So he used to go to this shop, and sorry, and Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University as well. So he used to go to this shop, and they put a portrait of him without naming the man in the picture. So again, that was a confirmation for me. Ashutosh Mukherjee has the necessary gravitas of a sweet shop owner. Sweet shop owner has the necessary gravitas of the Vice Chancellor or historian, great historian. So I took these pictures of these portraits. I went to all these places, Shialda, Nokur, all the sweet shops I'd never heard of on the way to North Calcutta. Stopping only when I saw an interesting portrait. That was one.
Eating a lot of sweets along the way.
I wish, but collecting sweets, yeah, admiring them, admiring the sweets. And then the other thing in the project, I think, was I would create, like road signs that you have outside on roads with a kind of blue background, white border and white letters. I thought I would create my own with, remembered lines which I thought were only capable of being accommodated by this space. So like, you cannot be serious. Or taka mati mati taka, which is Ramakrishna Paramhansa. Or full of merit but poetically man dwells on the earth, which is Heidegger. So all of this I put into these road signs. And that was the second project. The third one was the number of gifts I'd been getting over the years, which we could not use because we had no use for them or didn't like them. The first one was I sang at a concert in Salt Lake, and they gave me a kind of 4 Tiffany lamp, a sensor lamp. You could touch it, and it would come on, and it was shaped like a Tiffany lamp. And I thought, we thought, what are we going to do with this? So I said to my wife that, please keep it, I will exhibit it in an exhibition of unusable gifts. So then after that, I began to collect gifts which I couldn't use for this future exhibition, which finally happened, and before that I took these pictures and made those road signs with a person at Goriahat who used to make road signs. And the poems began to happen after about a week, after I'd gone to Shialda and all these places, taking pictures of the sweet shop owners. So that's how I began to write about the sweet shop. So should I read a couple?
Love to hear some. I can't help but notice that it's as if you'd moved from. We're beginning to talk about. We began by talking about narrative and poetry. Now we're talking about kind of conceptual art and poetry.
Conceptual
right?
art and poetry, yeah, that's true. But that foray into conceptual art, but also the foray into North Calcutta, and into the sweet shops, brought back something very sensuous and immediate to me. But yeah, so it kind of, the long drought ended, and I began to write these poems. So I'll just read maybe 2 or 3 of them. The first one is the first poem, Sweet Shop. The whole universe is here. Every color, a few on the verge of being barely tolerable. Every shape as well as minute flourishes created in the prehistory of each Shondesh by precise pinches. The horizontal trays brim but don't tremble with mass and form. The serrations are near invisible. You'd miss them if they were deeper or clearer. The soft oblongs and the minuscule hard pillow-shaped ones are generated so neatly that instinct alone could have given them shape, and no mold. In the harmony shielded by the glass is an unnoticed balance of gravity and play. That is Sweet Shop. I'll just read out a couple more. This is called Shamolda. It's about a cousin of mine, I think, but it has a sweet shop in it. Shamolda, you had possibly traveled over 1,000 miles when once, on our way to Rishra, pierced by hunger, you chose to stop the car and alight for a sweet. Hunger impelled you to those windows behind which, around hard shondesh and the ooze of chom-chom and the yellow puddle of rabri, a haze of insects were hovering or swimming or climbing as on an island without a human being. The ants, though touched by the mishti's resin, had laboriously freed themselves to ascend slopes. The flies, enlarged by these environs, banged into each other. I asked you how you brought yourself to eat a specimen from that tray. What if there's something on it? And you laughed like a girl and invoked the Bengali imperative of hunger, evidently more immediate than sorrow. I would flick it off and eat. You waved away in a gesture the invisible living creature as if dismissing some stupid universal decorum. And the last one from this collection, Bhimnak, since I mentioned it. Not that deep into the north, but it feels the world's transformed, the twin poles of the handcart immovable, pointedly thwarting buses, robust men unfocused yet engrossed in everything but the lax neighborly goats. Unlike the desultory south, the road has no angles and is interminable, culvert-like. It and the drifting buildings make the journey north echo that trip to Venice. The rubbish floats on a current. Just here, processions from College Square will veer towards the unobtrusive fork at Nirmal Chandra Street and make their way to Esplanade, intermittently protesting a malignant dispensation. Here is Bhimnag. Before reaching it, I tasted its doi. A pink so shadowy it feels the colors all but drained away. I pick up a pot. It's the same. So uncannily sweet, so close to liquid, you swallow it as it lies on your tongue. Nothing of the outside is here. Legends hang on walls. The interior has, despite its abundance, the quiet of Ramakrishna's room in Dakhineshwar. On one half of white Shandesh, rose petals rest with funereal simplicity.
Thanks, Amit. There's so much to say about Sweet Shop and the different kind of poetry that you're exploring in this collection, and also the continuities, the kind of urban geography, that's taking place in a different kind of way here. I also think about the title, and I think about, you were saying earlier on how the sweet shop owner and the university founder sit side by side, right? So that the university becomes like a kind of sweet shop, or a sweet shop becomes a metaphor for right these different institutional spaces and political spaces. I also think of a sweatshop when and there's different ways of thinking about what what India, what spaces might be ways of metaphors for thinking about India.
Yes.
But I also feel like I don't want to lose the opportunity to talk about your acceleration toward becoming a poet now, because there are 17 years between St. Cyril's Road and Sweet Shop, and a very brief period of time between Sweet Shop and Ramanujan.
Yeah, I was just
so can you talk about like that, you hadn't been thinking about writing for poetry for some time. It seems like this almost happened, Sweet Shop almost happened, not by accident, but suddenly or unexpectedly. And then now do you feel yourself returning to poetry with Ramanujan and with the New and Selected?
Yes, I mean, between 2018 and say until when I produced Ramanujan, I was writing poetry frequently by any standards, not just my own. And that made me that worried me. but at the same time, I was letting it happen. I mean, the form had come back to me in terms of, I work across various kind of genres, disciplines, and one of the things that I'm thinking about is the excitement of particular forms in terms of what I'm going to explore with that impulse. So, the sound of a train in Berlin made me write a song about it. This was in 2007. So it's a question of, as you open up yourself to genres, projects, and follow through, as I was saying, with the art project. You have an idea, then you think, so at another time you would write an essay maybe about these ideas, about collecting gifts, which we have no use for. Maybe even write a poem about it if that particular thing is available to you. You'd begin to think in terms of that form. In that case, I thought I would actually do an art exhibition, and that was a new step for me to take. So then that opens up things for you, and all of these impulses and the idea of following them through a particular genre seems like a bad idea, and then you have to follow through. So with poetry, it must have come to me in the same way, and then of course I would hesitate. I mean, should I do this? And then follow through. So something opens up. It's like knowing another language. You're picking up another language. That's one way of describing it. So at this time, I am writing poems. Now, again, I'm writing fewer, but I still am writing more compared to what I was, let's say, in the early 2000s or through the 90s.
Will you read some poems from Ramanujan?
Yes. I mean, I think we're sort of coming to running out of time, but I'll just read a one maybe from Ramanujan and maybe some couple of new very short poems. I'll read out the title poem. Ramanujan is the mathematician I'm referring to over here. So this poem is about a memory of Oxford, my days in Oxford. Mahesh would cycle or simply stride to the Broad Street Wimpy's to get himself a bean burger. With the wisdom not expected of a Tamil Brahmin from Delhi, he claimed it would suffice. In Balliol, the alternative was jeweled Brussels sprouts and carrots in remnants of lukewarm water. On good days, the vegetarians, might stumble upon sauerkraut or steaming cauliflower or gratin. U. Hiraman chose to forage weekly up the Cowley Road for turmeric, rice, and chickpeas and potent jars of chana masala powder. In the co-op, you'd spotted yogurt. It was chickpeas that kept you alive. In hall, you scrutinized the mash. Poor Ramanujan. 70 years before you, he must have been the first meat-abhorring Hindu to conjure up from odds and ends. No spices then in Oxbridge, no curry leaves, hardly anything even for ordinary Englishmen in a time of conflict and rationing. A semblance at odd hours of night and day of an aroma that half pacified the voice that asked, "Why are you here?" That's Ramanujan. I'm going to go back on what I just said and read out the first section, just the first of this thing called short Q&A. I'm just going to read the first one. It's a series that I kind of created in terms of questions and answers. Short Q&A. It's the first one. I'm just reading the first one that set it off. How do you know if you're an experimental filmmaker? It's the first question. Answer. If after decades of making cinema and receiving acclaim and honors, the Damocles of uncertainty hangs on you as you begin your new film, just as it did when you'd made your first. If there is no guarantee that it will be shown in cinemas or even seen, you can conclude with some certainty that you're an experimental filmmaker. So that is. Should I read a few very short poems just to end this?
Please.
These are uncollected. So
New work.
New work. We have? I have to go for the Parsi lunch. No. Look, here I'm going to read out two very short poems and a translation from Tagore.
Great.
This one, the first one I'm going to read out. It's called Cold Soup. It happened because I was watching some film, and when actors eat food in films, I always feel concerned for them. I think how many takes, and what temperature is the food? Is it food? Here first for me, I was watching an actor sitting and having soup. I was thinking, my God, this is even worse than having noodles, or spaghetti. What does this feel like? Yeah. So the poem comes from that. Cold Soup, it's called. Imaginary gardens with real toads. Does that include the taste of soup, which in the story has just been served, but by the 10th take's gone creamy and cold? Dinner time is garden in which the character sits, the toads invisible, private to the actor's stoic moment of tasting. I wonder if this too is poetry. That is Cold Soup. And this one is called Chena Shandesh Bhubaneswar. I had gone to Bhubaneswar. I had interesting experiences over there. I gave my first speech in Hindi because I felt that they were not going to follow, what I was going to say in English, and it went well. But before that, I was hungry, and they followed the Hindi. Yeah. Anyway, my Hindi at least. And then. But before that, we were at a bureaucrat's place, in his office. I can't remember who he was now. And I was hungry, and I said, "Can I have some tea?" He said, "Okay." I was being a bit rude, but I was very hungry. So I just arrived from Calcutta, and the things were coming in, unlikely things with tea, like banana and whatnot. Anyway, so but one of the things was this amazing shandesh made of chana, or chena as they call it. This is really extraordinary texture, very tasty. Somehow, for some reason I wrote this poem. Chena Shandesh Bhubaneswar. Little of the inexhaustible grime in the world can stain its firm, yielding grain. It's as if the caviar of its surface became a filtering machine, kidneys flushing out darkness. In each minute component, it stays contra the world, chronic, resolute white. Chena Shandesh. To end with, I've been translating, so has my wife, Tagore songs, and This is a Tagore song I translated maybe a year and a half ago. I'm going to read out the original Tagore song. I'm not going to sing it, but I'll read out the original Tagore song, which I first heard in a recording by Shubinay Rai. It's a wonderful recording of this song. Shokolo garbo duro kori dibo, tomaro garbo chharibo na. Shobare ডাকিয়া কহিব যেদিন পাবো তব পদ রেণুকণা তব আহ্বান আসিবে যখন সে কথা কেমনে করিব গোপন সকল বাক্যে সকল কর্মে প্রকাশিবে তব আরাধনা যত মান আমি পেয়েছি যে কাজে সেদিন সকলই যাবে দূরে শুধু তব মান দেহে মনে মোর বাজিয়া উঠিবে এক সুরে পথেরও পথিক সেও দেখে যাবে তোমারও বারতা মোর মুখ ভাবে ভব সংসার বাতায়ন তলে বসে রব যবে আনমনা This is one word, ভব সংসার বাতায়ন তলে. It's one word. The wordplay in Tagore is very interesting, including সকল গর্ব দূর করি দিব তোমারও গর্ব কি how do you I'll let go of all pride but your pride I'll hold dear. That is the pride I take in you. But you know the construction tomar we usually tomar khub garbo hoyeche you're very proud or you're too proud of yourself. But in what way is your pride a construction? You know, pride in you is being transferred and turned into something else through this particular kind of wordplay, which is a very different form of wordplay from our understanding of that word through Western literature, English literature. So I'll read out the translation, which doesn't attempt to emulate the original. I mean, it can't. It attempts to be itself. I let go of all pride, but your pride I'll hold dear. The day I touch the dust on your feet, I'll summon and tell everyone. Once your call makes its way to me, how will I keep it hidden in secrecy? Every action, every phrase will become an expression of prayer. On that day, whatever honors I've had for whatever work will grow distant from me. Only your honor in body and heart will resonate as melody. The passerby too will see as he passes the news of you in the look on my face. Under the window of all visible existence, I'll be sitting abstractedly. Is it extraordinary for a man to write a song with these words? Well, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, everyone. Please join us this afternoon for our later events in the day.